Okay.
Here. Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And tonight we have Marcie Rendon here with us, Marcie R Rendon. She's going to be discussing her Cash Blackbear series, and in particular, the brand new one, Sinister Graves. I don't know if you can see this, but Marcie very kindly signed a whole bunch of books for us, which just came in. I think it was today, maybe Friday. And if you'd like one of them, I will go ahead and put a link in the comments field. And if you have questions for Marcie, please go ahead and put them in. And Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour. And I'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Marcie, what a pleasure to meet you. This is your third book, but I thought we might talk about the early books. But let me say first, what excellent timing it is, because today, October 10th, is Indigenous Peoples Day, and Cash Blackbear is a native Ojibwe. So are you yourself?
Yes, I'm from a citizen of the White Earth Nation here in northern Minnesota.
Wonderful. So how do you feel about this holiday?
I think it's an important day. I think it's important that it got changed from Columbus Day to Indigenous Day. And I think that every day on this continent should be Indigenous Day. You know, I mean, this is our land. It's our place. You know, our ancestors are here. And I think that there should always be an honoring of that.
We had a conversation with an author from South Africa on Saturday, and the mystery involves the Bushmen. And, you know, we had this same conversation. I do a lot of events with Australians, and it's the same conversation. And, you know, it's been a Eurocentric view of history for so long that I think it's wonderful that it's evolving. We're also in the middle, this is the last week, if I recall right, of Hispanic Heritage Month. So, you know, yet another honoring of different cultures. And I think it's all wonderful. But what I really like, I said to Marcie before we started that, is that the mystery form is not necessarily one that other cultures embraced early on. And I remember when there was almost nothing translated from the Japanese, for example. And now there's a tremendous number. Your own publisher publishes lots of books written in native Japanese and now translated into English. And that's true all over the world. So the crime novel as a literary form has really adapted and spread. I think it's very exciting. It's a hugely broad umbrella. So Marcie, we didn't talk to you for your first two books, Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing. So why don't we start with Murder on the Red River? And actually, why don't we start with talking about the Red River? Because I have to tell you that I was looking at the wrong Red River, and I had to get out my phone and actually Google your Red River, which I was fascinated to see flows north and ends up in Hudson's Bay.
Right. You know, northern Minnesota at some point in history was glacial.
Mhm.
And the glacier moved north. And when it moved north, it just sheared everything totally flat. And what's left of the glacier is like Lake Winnipeg and Hudson Bay, you know, the further north you go. And so that's why this Red River runs north. It's the only river on the continent that runs north, and the tributaries that go into it. Yeah, so it because of the glacier, because of the way that it was created, and then the fact that it floods every spring, it has historically it's had 2-foot deep farm soil, some of the richest in the world. And you know, the Red River Valley up here has been called the breadbasket of the world. Potatoes, sugar beets, wheat, corn, soybeans, all are growing in this valley that, you know, you can just see for miles across the prairie up there.
So it's really like the Nile in a way, isn't it? The way the Nile, until they built Aswan Dam and screwed it up. But the Nile did the same thing, which what I really hate is the hippopotamus and the other animals that can't get past the dam, in addition to the problems that it creates for people. But yeah, I was just in your city for the International Mystery Convention, which met this year in September in St. Paul and Minneapolis.
Yes.
And my husband and I only stayed for a day, and then we jumped on a ship to sail down the Mississippi
Oh, did
to
you?
St. Louis, which
Oh,
really exciting. But I'll tell you, Marcie, what really surprised us was that there's a series of locks, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built some very elaborate dam work and so forth. So we, being untutored, we thought that it was for flood control. But it turns out that the lock system and the dam system is merely to keep a 9-foot channel going, so that the barge traffic and all the produce that, stuff that Marcie's talking about could move down the Mississippi. They assumed that they didn't need it below St. Louis, but I did read, depressingly, that the lower Mississippi is run dry. And part of that is because the Missouri is like 70% down. So, has the Red River shown any of the drought damage that other rivers are clearly experiencing?
The Red River Valley, it floods and that's dependent on the amount of snow that falls in the winter, and then the rate at which it melts. So if you can have a shorter, a less deep snow cover,
Right.
but if it melts in one day, it'll flood.
I see.
It won't flood as much as when there's 6-foot
Right.
snow, snow mountains, snow hills, whatever they want to call it. But but we have been in a drought. The whole, this climate change is real.
Yeah,
And I think,
sure.
People need to recognize that and really start to figure out a different way of being with the earth.
Oh, I absolutely agree. One of the other things that I think is clear from writers writing about Minnesota, also Maine, Montana, and so forth, is that we concentrate on our southern border for a variety of reasons, but we actually have a northern border. It's been a peaceful border, and so we've taken it kind of for granted that everything's okay. I think the pandemic certainly changed some aspects of that, but Minnesota is in fact a border state, and the farther north you go, the more. And so certainly indigenous people could have cared less about whatever the boundary lines were, right? It was just all homeland.
And there's what's called the Jay Treaty, which Canada honors it. It says that Native people can travel back and forth.
Right.
They have dual citizenship. The United States doesn't honor that treaty.
Really?
Like, we don't have the freedom to just go back and forth in the same way that Canada will allow.
Well, I'm not going to get into U.S. immigration policy, which personally I think sucks. But anyway, let's talk about Cash. I'll get it right here in a minute. Blackbear, what an interesting character she is. How did she come to you?
I had decided that I was going to, because what I read is crime novels, and I had decided that if I was going to write a book, I would write a crime novel. I wrote 2 or 3. They're sitting in my garage. They're really bad books. It was like, these will never sell. I gave up, and I was writing like a fluff book. And Cash Blackbear as a character sort of like appeared, like she was just like, oh, no, no, no. And this whole other story started to, like come through my brain onto my computer, and I started writing Murder on the Red River. And as long as I kept writing that story, I could tell that it was working. And like now that I'm on the 3rd book, I mean, I can see Cash, I can hear Cash, I can, I get to know her like a person. But yeah, she literally is like, oh, no, no, no. And this whole other story appeared.
So she wasn't interested in fluff.
No, she was not interested in fluff at all.
Right. So in her story, she is a child who was left abandoned by her parents or something happened to her family when she was very young.
You know, during that time in history, this is factual history. In the early 1950s and 60s, the United States government had a policy of taking Native children from their parents and placing them in white foster homes. And the Red Lake Reservation, which is in northern Minnesota, they know that 60% of those children were removed and placed in white foster homes. And from my reservation, from White Earth, they can only estimate, and they figure that it was between 40 and 60% of the children were removed and placed in white foster homes. In the Southwest, there were thousands of Native children that were taken and placed in farm communities to work on the farms. And this was all during that 50s and 60s period. In Canada, it was called the Scoop.
Right.
And, you know, for many of the families, there was no legitimate reason to take the children. In Murder on the Red River, Cash's mom ended up in the hospital, or yeah, she'd rolled the car. And so the kids, two other kids were in the hospital, and Cash's mom had been drinking. And so it was like, that would have been enough to just the county to step in and say, nope, we're taking all the kids. And so that's an underlying theme throughout all of the books. And on Murder on the Red River, I think it's on page 24 or 28, there's a line where it says, and she never saw her mother again. Excuse me. And my first publisher said, no one's going to believe that. I said, what do you mean they're not going to believe it? It happened all the time.
Yeah.
Like, that's just a common story. And so she said, oh, so that explains a whole lot of the rest of the book. But what happens is that the majority of people in the world don't necessarily know the history. They don't know about this scooping and taking of children. They don't, you know. So, and I wasn't trying to write a history book. I was trying to write a crime story. And so this backstory of Cash being taken and going through a string of foster homes and then working farm labor, that was just so common because Native kids were taken and placed on farms and then became field hands. That was just normal. And then when they would turn 18, they would just be kicked out. That, you know, that's fact. And so that backstory is woven in through the crime story.
It is indeed. Now, I have a question just for my own enlightenment. We have Indian schools here, but we have a major thoroughfare here in Phoenix called Indian School Road. What's the difference between taking children and putting them in foster homes and taking children and putting them in Indian schools? Was the foster home thing intended to create a labor force, whereas the Indian schools were intended to change an acculturation process?
I
thought that most of the children that were taken from their families were sent to schools rather than to foster homes. So obviously, I don't know very much about this.
Yeah, there's layers of history. Originally, or, you know, there was the wars, which was an attempt to wipe us out as a people. And then it was the boarding school era where
Right.
children were taken and put in boarding schools and shipped across country and, you know, never got back home again.
Right.
Many never made it back home. And after that era was this foster care era.
Okay. I understand. So the boarding school thing was probably what, in the 1930s and 20s?
Correct.
Before the war. All right.
Yeah.
And it was, what was the purpose of it? I mean, you know, I can see what you're saying about they were put with foster families so they could become field hands, but if they were put into boarding schools, what was the end purpose?
Who was the president at the time? The whole thing was kill the Indian, save the man. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. but the boarding school, the intent of that was to take people away from their culture, take them
Right.
away from their language. And at the schools, many, it wasn't so much education as it was training people to be housemaids or farmers,
Okay,
trades, you know?
gotcha.
Yeah.
So it was more like vocational school than it was like college. All right. Well,
Much
thank you
more
for,
4-year-olds, 5-year-olds up to,
right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there have been terrible things uncovered in Canada and in this country about the whole boarding school thing, but I didn't know nearly as much about the foster home. So I can certainly see that it's made Cash a very different person than she would have been if she had stayed home and, with her family, if that had been possible. But, on the other hand, how was her mother as a mother? I mean, have you really
no,
explored
I
that?
think that the many of these mothers were perfectly fine mothers. And, like I live here in Minneapolis and had a neighbor who, a non-native family that dad drank all the time, held
Mhm.
the kid out the window by its feet
Wow.
as punishment. Did child protection ever come in and take their kids? No.
Well,
There was there's a different history here, and the different intention.
well, yeah, no, I can absolutely see that. And it, again, it comes back to a Eurocentric, point
Right.
of view, looking at history, which is undergoing considerable revision at the moment. So I haven't congratulated you on your review of the New York Times yesterday, and I quoted from it when I sent out our very large email today announcing this week's event. Um, and it basically, the first part of it covers what we were just talking about, other than saying her birth name was Renee, which is French. So how did she come to be called Cash instead of Renee?
Well, in Murder on the Red River is when she starts. I mean, there's a backstory where she's in a foster home and she gets a chance to work in the fields. Her foster mother kicks her out of the house. And so she just goes to work with the men. And her foster father hires her out to other farmers and she gets a little bit of cash. And so
Yeah,
they ask her, how come you're not, why are you out here with the men? How come you're not doing women's work? And she says, because I want the cash. I need the cash. And so then she got the name Cash.
got it. So what happens how did she become an investigator? Because, that obviously, if you're writing a crime novel, there has to be some sort of crime and investigation to make it actually work. So what is the crime in Murder on the Red River?
There's a dead guy in a field. Um, and there's this whole story too of her relationship with the county sheriff. He's the one that sort of mentors her, takes care of her in a certain kind of ways, make sure that she's okay. And he's actually gotten her out of the worst foster home. And then she has this intuitive ability to sense things, and he knows that. And so he, in Murder on the Red River, he asks her for her help to figure out how this guy died or where he's from, who he belongs to.
So does that progress in Girl Gone Missing, where she once again is she now official, or is she still helping him?
She's still helping him. I mean, she's still in all 3 books. She's still a farm laborer. She did go to college. Um, you know, Sheriff Wheaton wants her to go to college, wants her to, do something. Um, he sees something more for her outside of field labor work. And so he's gotten her to go to college. So she's going to college and still doing farm labor work. And back in the 50s and 60s, the racism was so the racism was so intense in this part of the country, and as it probably was all over, is that Native women actually did, many of them worked farm labor because they couldn't get jobs that
Right.
non-Native people could get. And so it was a common practice for Native women to be out picking potatoes or working the beet fields or doing, hoeing beets during beet season, springtime. So it wasn't an uncommon job even for her to be a farm laborer at that time in history.
Well, in fact, this series is set in the 1970s, which I didn't mention, but so it is, it's 50 years ago. So it really is historical fiction. It's hard for me to
We
imagine
found that
that.
out this year.
I know. I mean, when I started the Poison Pen, Marcie, in 1989, the 1920s was considered historical fiction, and it was sort of hard to even count the 1930s. But now, that was 50 years earlier. And now in the 2022, the 1970s are that 50-year remove.
Yes.
And we start thinking, where do you draw the line where historical fiction becomes, and there are advantages to writing historical fiction, lots of them. For one thing, there's no technology. So
There's
you
no
don't have to.
DNA, there's no cell phones.
Exactly. It makes life a lot easier for the crime novels. Now, a phrase in the Times that really struck me about Cash: she's polished a hard-drinking, pool-playing, truck-driving veneer that conceals almost every trace of vulnerability, except when her guardian, Sheriff Wheaton, enlists her help. So is this a kind of carapace that she's constructed for herself, kind of like a beetle living, inside a shell, so part of how she gets through the world?
When I'm writing, I'm not thinking about all of these kinds of questions. I'm just writing the story. And it wasn't until after the fact when there are university classes that are using both Murder on the Red River and Girl Gone Missing in like psychology classes, women's classes, feminist classes, social studies. And one of the college professors, she has me come speak to her classes. She has they're studying Cash's PTSD.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, like that was not like in my mind when I was writing the story. But as soon as she said it, it was like, oh yeah, she has PTSD from the trauma that she went through in these foster homes and being separated from her family, all of that.
Right.
But that wasn't in my mind when I was writing the story.
Well, no, it's your author's subconscious. It's always amazing to me. I've been talking to authors for over 30 years, and it's always interesting to me, particularly, Marcie, at events when a fan attending it will ask a question, and I see the author getting this kind of astonished look, like, did I write that? Or that's not what I meant? Or how did you get that out of my book? Or whatever. And I think that the creative imagination is almost a thing by itself.
In my brain, I'm always writing a story,
Right.
or I'm making up a story, or it's always kind of like.
But you have to draw on things to create it. You have to draw on your own life experience, or stories that you've been told.
That I see around me, yeah.
Exactly. In a way, being a storyteller is kind of a synthesis. That's a hard word, synthesis it is, because that's why I'm very suspicious of extremely young storytellers or extremely young novelists, because I think they just haven't lived long enough to have that kind of experience to draw on. And so often, as you've already indicated is true for you, the first published book by an author is not the first book that the author has written. So some of them are just like practice books where you're trying to figure out, do you have a story to tell? Do you even know how it tells? And that's one of the advantages of the mystery form, is that the mystery form has a reasonably clear structure. There are conventions that run through the crime novel. And I think in a lot of ways for new writers, it makes it easy to work out the structure of the story. Did you find that to be true? Since you're a crime reader, a fan, you kind of knew how it was supposed to go?
I guess so, yes. I mean, I've read so much. I would, like read all the time, all the time. I don't have any formal training, like I don't have an MFA. I've never gone to.
No, but reading is your school. I mean, reading is your
Exactly.
training,
Yeah. And I've read crime.
right?
I
So
I've
then you
talked,
had, yeah, you had an instinctive understanding of how a crime novel was
yeah.
supposed to go.
I
And
tried to write romance and it's like I've never read romance. Like I don't read it. Like,
right.
yeah.
Well, romance is a fairly simple story, with you just it's the complications. Well, it really is. Although
I've heard, but if you don't read it,
yeah.
I can't write
Well,
it.
it has evolved in some interesting ways due to our more not just only multicultural, but let's say fluid genders. Is that it used to be a pretty standard, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy wins girl, but now there are a huge number of variations. The same three things are
Right.
true,
Right.
but the players are often
Okay.
totally different. So, I find that to be really fun and fascinating as well. So in this book, we were finally getting to, well, what did happen in Girl Gone Missing? We didn't actually go there. What happened?
So again, the books are set in 1970, and in 1970 in northern Minnesota, the women who were being trafficked were the blonde, blue-eyed farm girls. They were the ones that were the most vulnerable from that region of the state. Native women were being trafficked out of the Duluth Harbor, but that's not where Cash lives. So in order for the story to happen, it's young white women that are being trafficked, and Cash helps solve that crime. And that's the storyline.
Okay. So they were going to the sex trade, not the field hand trade.
It's literally people taking women and trafficking them. It's not girls making a choice.
No, I understand that, but were they being sold basically into the sex trade rather
Yes.
than, I
Yes.
mean, they weren't being field handed. I mean, they're being sold as
Right.
right for pornographic purposes and even very young children, unfortunately, fall prey to that. Duluth, that's an interesting thought. I'm actually taking a cruise of the Great Lakes next year, and we're starting in Duluth, where I've never been. So Duluth was a major harbor for sex trafficking, really?
For Native women, yes.
Wow.
And the non-Native women from the Red River Valley were being trafficked through Minneapolis over to Chicago, New York, and or the West Coast.
I'm sad that you knew all about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. So let's move on to Sinister Graves, the third story here. And do you think, one of the hallmarks of the whole Nordic noir, Scandi noir, which has surprised me over the years, is there are so many weirdly fundamental religious groups that seem to dwell in these freezing climates like not northern Finland, because those are Laplanders, but northern Sweden, for example, or Norway. And it comes up a lot. Are there, in your experience, or have you heard about, because there is a community, a religious community involved in this story. Are there a number of them in northern Minnesota, or is that just something that you made up?
There, in recent years, there was a cult or a community, and I don't even want to say a town name because I haven't looked recently to see where it was. I just know
Sure.
it was in northern Minnesota in one of these isolated towns, and the guy had a number of wives, blah 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 blah, and it was a religious thing, and he went someplace. Um, I don't know if he went to Mexico or Brazil or something like that. And so that's the one that I know the most recent. And then I've heard stories,
Mm.
of, well, in this town, da 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 is happening, or but I don't, which is part of what is fascinating to me writing about rural life is that you hear these stories, but people don't want to like name names or, out anybody.
Right.
Um, and so it's all kind of left to your imagination unless somebody gets arrested. Um, and there are a number of fundamentalist like groups. I don't know that they're all like this evil whatever, but because I'm a writer, that's how this story came out. And
Well,
because of the devastation that the churches have played in the destruction of Native culture and peoples. The back in, I think, President Grant, I think it was, during that era, this was like around the boarding school time. The Quakers, there was a meeting at some Quaker place in Pennsylvania, and the United States government literally divided up the country between 11 Christian denominations and said the Presbyterians can have this part of the country, the Catholics can have this, the Methodists can have this. And that's where boarding schools came out of. And so it was these religious denominations under the approval and go ahead from the United States government. And the churches have played a big part in the removal of children. And so that's all of that comes into my brain as I'm writing the story.
Why, so true in Hawaii. It was the missionaries that went, and that the Polynesian culture was so disrupted by missionaries. There was really, look at the Spaniards. They came over here, and the Jesuits were right there in the conquistadores' tracks, determined to destroy the religions and so forth. I've been all over South America, and it's really extraordinary to go in Cusco, for example, to the cathedral there, and to see the combination of Spanish and Incan that eventually kind of fused.
Yeah.
Fascinating, but yes, I organized religion is responsible for many ills, no question about it. And I also think that in isolated, we have, Marcie, believe me, we've had that problem here in northern Arizona, where, the Mormon church is the only, kind of legitimate, and no longer apparently recognizes polygamy, but there are all kinds of fundamentalist branches of the Mormons who think, I keep wondering how anybody could actually believe that Joseph Smith had a vision as opposed to just wanting to have multiple wives. I just stick at that, but there we are. But yeah, in smaller communities, it's possible for things like that to happen. My friend Dana Stabenow, who lives in Alaska and writes about Alaska and indigenous, she has a heroine called Kate Shugak, who is native in Alaska. And Kate once says that a place like Alaska attracts the radical left and the radical right. It's a place where people go to reinvent themselves. But that would be true, it seems to me, in any remote area like northern Minnesota, rural northern Minnesota, or even rural Arizona.
Exactly. Right.
So anyway, so Cash gets sucked into, it's an interesting case because it unfolds kind of slowly. And you're not sure. I thought it was a really interesting book because you kind of move slowly into it. And I like that. I like the way it unfolds. And it, because thrillers are so obvious from the outset. There's a real difference between a thriller and then this kind of investigation. A thriller, you usually know right up front, what
one of the
things are happening.
Been told by Native people is that the books are written in the same way that we tell stories.
And that is?
It's exactly what you said. It just kind of evolves and builds on itself, and it's not that
Right.
kind of pace thing.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. What I also like is the fact that it does move forward. There are so many books today written on all these tell no one and untrustworthy narratives and so forth, where you get pieces of stuff. But I like investigations where you start And then whatever pace you move at, you actually move forward, from the beginning to the end. I
Yeah.
like that. So I wasn't sure that I didn't know whether that was the way that stories are normally told. And so does the Ojibwe have a strong oral storytelling tradition?
I think that all of us did because none of us had a written language prior
Right.
to contact. And so everything was told, and it was told over and over and over again. And there was an expectation that you would just commit the story, commit the
Memory.
tradition to memory so that
Right.
you could repeat it on to the next generation. Um, so yeah, there's a strong storytelling tradition, which I don't feel like I was a part of. People say, well, did your mom and dad or, grandpa tell you stories? It's like, no. But I think there's a way of communicating where you're ta- you're talking, you're telling the story, you're telling what happened. So even if it's not storytelling,
Right.
it's this way of communicating what's happened so that people know what's going on. I don't know how to explain it.
Well, it actually is the same way that the Odyssey was written and the Iliad, because those stories were told before writing. And basically they were mnemonics. That's why there are all those repeat phrases, like the wine dark sea, for example, because it allowed the person telling the story. It was like punctuation or something. You'd tell the story and you'd get to that phrase, and then there would be another part of the story.
Right. You repeat it. Yes. I
Yep.
understand that.
Well, but I think in any oral storytelling, there has to be those repetitions.
Mhm.
They're like markers, and they also, they're like chapter endings too, in the sense that you get there and then your story can move forward. So I did wonder if that was part of what was going on in the way you told this story.
Again, it wasn't a conscious thought. It's only after they've been written and having conversations with people like you or going and talking in a university class where it's like, oh, okay. It
Well,
does
I'm
make
I'm too
sense.
analytical. See, I'm not a writer. I'm an editor and a bookseller, and so I tend to be analytical. But the one question I haven't asked you, which I should be asking you, is how much fun have you had doing this?
Well, I love the writing. I love writing. That's been true my whole life. I love making stories. I love the I don't know if power is the right word, but that the fact that you can write and you can make people have emotions, you can make them see pictures, you can make them, I mean, people read these books and they'll come up to me, like there's two college professors in particular who'll say to me, has Cash stopped drinking?
Right.
Like she's never going to finish college if she doesn't quit drinking. Or, when's she going to stop smoking? And I'm like they care about her.
Right.
Like she's real to them. And to be able to do that for readers to me is wonderful. I love being able to do that. Um, and people have told me that they've cried, and I'm like, oh no, I didn't mean for you to cry. Like I didn't want somebody to cry, but they're moved, and to be able to do that for people who love to read, that's important to me, and I enjoy doing that, and I enjoy um, you write a paragraph and then you say, oh, well, I could say it this way and it would be that much better or that much stronger. That's
Yeah.
for me the fun of writing. And I write all kinds of things. I write the novels, I write plays, I write poetry, I write um, lyrics sometimes for a classical composer friend of mine. Um, I still do some journalism work. I like writing.
Yeah. You like words too.
Yes.
I mean, you can't be a writer if you can't command words. And that's really, it's like, musicians have to know notes. You have to know words. And how wonderful that you can touch people's hearts like that. That's a really important thing.
Yeah.
So Patrick, let's call you up because we've been wandering around in your territory here for some time.
All right. Actually, yeah, really interesting conversation. Marcie, I have a question for you. And that is, I know a lot of tribes, I'm not sure if this is a universal kind of thing, but I know that some of the tribes have pretty strong taboos regarding, death and things like subjects of death and burial and things like that. Does that play into your work at all?
There are things that I won't write about.
Okay.
And that's just my own personal decision, and my own personal belief in in how I live my life and how the people around me live their lives. So yeah, there are things that I won't write.
Yeah. Well, I know that, for instance, in Ramona, have you read Ramona Emerson's
Shutter?
Shutter? Oh,
Yeah,
terrific book. And we had a fun,
it's
but
great.
that certainly is a big point of conflict with her character, and her grandmother who she lives with. And I
Mhm.
know that there are certain taboos that play into it.
Right.
So, yeah. What about, Barbara is asking you about writing a book set in the 70s. And doesn't seem like that long ago, but are there such in the editing process, how can you find an editor who knows the references? And some of those little subtleties, those nuances, slang expressions of the era. How do you kind of work on getting those things right?
There's this wonderful thing called Google. That's, you could, I did Google, because there's a difference. There's a difference between US slang spoken in California in the 1970s
Sure.
and US slang spoken by vets in Vietnam.
Right.
So how, so like Google. And then I had a friend who has since passed um, read the portions of the book. I believe it's in Girl Gone Missing that have to do with Vietnam. And, just said to him, tell me what's right, tell me what's wrong. Um, and he said that what I'd written about Vietnam, I'm talking now about Girl Gone Missing. He said, that's good, but you have a car wrong. And I can't even remember what it was. Like somebody's driving like a Dodge something, and I had the wrong, like a Ford Nova, Dodge Charger, but it was supposed to be a Pontiac, you
I
know,
see.
that kind of thing. So,
Right.
It seems to me one way around that, Patrick, would be to read books that were published in that
Sure.
time because they would actually have the right language and so forth. I mean, there's a ton of literature written about the war, for example,
Oh,
in
yeah.
the 70s
Absolutely.
that, you don't even have to Google it. You can just read the books and kind of immerse yourself in that
There's
language.
also that great, the late 60s, early 70s, of course, the counterculture and Vietnam and everything was also this great burst of, Native American writers, getting published like Mama Day and Silko and,
so go, yeah.
my favorite, James Welch, who I really love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so many writers. Were any of those inspirational to you?
Probably, Housemaid of Dawn,
Yep.
Scott Mama Day. And then anything by Vine Deloria
All
that
right.
um the the politics,
Custer died for your sins and so
right?
forth. Right.
God is Red.
Right.
And David Martinez, who's a college professor down in the Southwest, he's done like an academic book about Vine Deloria's writing. I haven't gotten it yet, but I will. The other person is Gerald Bissner, who's from
Right.
White Earth.
Oh, okay.
He came out with some poetry and some other books, and then a film during that same time.
Well, you're very lucky that Scott Momaday came to visit us. I'm trying to remember, Patrick, who else I have, and Leslie Sokol also, because
Yep.
I'm looking over here at my own, I'm in my library looking at bookshelves, and I see I have some autographed books by both of them. So, and, you know, and then, well,
Taught at U of A, I think.
right. And then, you know, we had Rodolfo Anaya making, you know, his wonderful book in Hispanic and so forth. You know, that book is on the banned book list. Do you believe that?
That'll be good for sales.
Bless me, Ultima. I know, but I mean, the reason that it's on the banned, I haven't quite figured it out. It has, I can't remember what, but anyway, you know, another trailblazer here, giving voice to Hispanic. And I've been really fascinated that of the long reading list now that we've had for Hispanic Heritage Month, for example, where 30 years ago I'd have been hard pressed to find like 2 books, and now you know there are whole strings of them. So I think we're really seeing an evolution of you know, of writing. Not an evolution. What's the word I want? Anyway, we're seeing many cultures coming forward with fiction in a way that I think wasn't true 30 years ago.
We've always written, but we haven't always gotten published before. And I think the publishing industry
We haven't always gotten published. Yeah,
right.
I know. And mainstream publishing is a lot different than university publishing or some small press publishing. And actually, I think that mainstream publishers are really sort of binging on it at the moment, which I think is great. The only disadvantage to that is that at some point there's always a kind of counteraction to it. But publishing has always leapt upon what they call trends. They always have. And, you know, they do them and then they fade. So what I'm hoping is that these wonderful voices from different cultures will not be perceived as a trend, but will be just part of, you know, everybody's fiction.
You got to hand it to Soho. You know, I've said they've really been reinventing themselves and what they do. And you know, Ramona's book and Gary and Naomi Hirahara, you know, they've been doing a lot of great books lately.
They have been. I know. David, I never could remember his entire name. David Hiska Wombly Wyden. Is that
Right,
it?
right.
Right. But he's not with Soho. I think he's with William Morrow. Do I have that right? He was our conversation partner with Ramona. And he lives in Colorado. He's a wonderful writer. Very slow though, because I think it's been 2 or 3 years. Hello, David, pay attention. I think it's been 2 or 3 years since his first book. And then Stephen Graham Jones, he's also he's with another big publisher. So it's exciting. And the more there are, and the more, you know, you do things together, the more interesting it is for readers.
A whole new generation, you know. I mean, Tommy Orange, and I'm going to blow his last name, but Oscar. How do you pronounce?
No, I can't pronounce his name either. I love his book.
Right. Exactly.
Calling for a Blanket Dance.
Yep.
Wonderful book. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely wonderful indeed. So, what are you working on now? Are you working on a 4th book for Cash? Are you still enough interested in her to keep writing her?
Yeah, I'm working on book 4. I have, and I'm working on a standalone novel that's a contemporary novel, which has cell phones and.
Oh, so you are being brave.
Have DNA in it. I can't even remember. A little bit of DNA in it. You know.
Excellent. Is it a crime novel?
Yeah.
So, well, that's wonderful. Good for you. I think that'll be fun to see how, you know, how it works for you, because you are in kind of a comfort zone in the 70s in terms of not having to deal with technology and whatever it is. Be challenging to do something where you have to, you know, cope with all that.
Right, right. And then I also have a play that's going to have a staged reading
Really?
here in the Twin Cities, November 7th, called Say Their Names. And it's a 2-person show about the missing and murdered Indian women. So that's, I mean, it's written and I'm working on some rewrites, and that's going to have a staged reading November 7th here. Yeah.
Oh, that's very
I'm
exciting.
working on that too.
So what about your poetry? You mentioned poetry, and I was really interested in that.
Mostly I've been anthologized. I feel like I've been anthologized to death. I don't have my own book of poetry, but in Joy Harjo's two recent books are in her third year of the poet laureate thing. I have a poem in each of those books.
Marvelous.
And yeah, I have short stories in some crime anthologies. I have a short story in a book called It's Not Crime. It's a nonfiction book about, the title is What God is Honored Here. And it's about birthing stories, miscarriage, stillbirths, etc., for and with women of color. So, I mean, like I said, I write all kinds of things.
Marcie, by any chance, do you know, she's a Dene writer named Laura Tohe?
I know the name, I don't know her.
She's a friend. She lives here. And, she does kind of the same thing. A little bit of everything. And she wrote a little memoir called No Parole Today, which was about her experience in boarding schools,
Oh, okay.
And then also she's written about the Canyon de Chelly but also these really interesting kind of opera sort of things that she's had staged where she writes the librettos, and just a really brilliant woman. And somebody on in the notes here or in the comments mentions Gerald Bissner again. He says I had him as a professor at U of M in the 70s, and he was brilliant, but I found him kind of hard to read, a little dense. I mean, didn't he write like the Monkey King of China and all these really interesting, bizarre sort of stories?
I haven't read his books. I mean, I haven't read those books. The books of his that I have are Anishinaabe songs, where
Okay.
it's the short, poetic, they're almost like haiku.
Oh, wow.
And I think he had two or three of those books back during that same time in the early 70s. And then he had a film. And I'm trying to remember what the name of maybe this person who's online from the 70s.
Yeah.
I went to that film opening here in the cities.
I need to revisit him because I remember when I tried to read him, I just had a difficult time. But it's always worth giving it another shot. And James Welch, he was my big favorite.
Right.
He died, didn't he?
Gerald
He died
Bissner
way too young.
Yeah, and back to Gerald Bissner. He has a new book out. I don't know how new it is now. Because everything before COVID seems like, the dark ages. But he talks about survivance, native survivance. There's a lot of talk about historical trauma and resilience, and Gerald Bissner talks about survivance. And I have wanted to read that, and I haven't gotten a chance to do that yet.
I have to pick it up.
Many years ago, I went to visit the Cherokee villages in North Carolina, from whence there's an actual play they put on about the Trail of Tears, about what happened when they were, it was Andrew Jackson, so we're all the way back in the early 1800s when they were forcibly evacuated and marched out to Oklahoma. And it's a very powerful thing to see. The play, I think it's called The Trail of Tears, although I might be wrong. Anyway, so, in all parts of this country, these stories, exist. And
the big story here is about the hanging of the 38. It's like 3 months after Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, he hung 38 Dakota soldiers here. And then the Dakota were exiled from the state of Minnesota. And
know that?
Yeah. And it's still on the law books that they're exiled, that's a word. Anyway, so there's Yeah, that's a story that needs to be told. There are so many stories like that that just, get erased from history.
Well, that's true, but as long as somebody remembers them, like you,
Right.
there's a chance that they can be written still. And I think the key to that, partly, Marcie, is that people are now willing to read them. There's no point in writing a story if nobody's going to. Well, there is a point, but ideally, if you write a story, you want people to read it. Let me put it that way. So I think right now there's a lot of interest in realigning our views about many things. But in the end, it isn't going to work if it isn't a good story. So your strength is that you do tell very good stories. It's really been a pleasure. I'm sorry that I missed your first two books, but I'm delighted to have had a chance to read this one and talk to you. So I hope we'll get to do it again with your next book, whether you come see us or we do it again. The only good thing that, to my mind, that's really come out of the pandemic is Zoom as a technology, because it lets us do so many things that were just not financially or even physically feasible as a bookstore. I mean, we talked with authors all over the world, Marcie, and we have an enormous international audience. It's really fascinating, isn't it, Patrick?
Yeah,
We have a regular in Italy. We have a regular, we did an event for an Icelandic author in which we had, I'm trying to remember, it was like thousands of people watching it, and almost none of them were in the United States.
Wow.
So, it was, it's been a very enhancing experience, to be
it's
able
kind of
to.
an interesting video archive of this time, like the last 3 years.
Yes.
How
I know it's over 900 by now. I mean,
Yeah.
some weeks we do 2 or 3 events in one day. I mean, we're doing 2 today, for example. So we have a live event at the store coming up. Wednesday, we're doing 2 events. One was sometime last week or the week before, I did 3 in one day. 2 of them were Zoom, I think, and one of them was live. But it has really, it has increased the number of conversations that we can have with authors and the number of books that we can highlight. And the other part that you might want to think about is that these things if they're not ticketed, if you don't force people to treat it like a play, where you buy a ticket and you have to show up at the right time or you lose it. These things have an enormously long life, and the book sales that follow that are really remarkable and stretch out over a great period of time, sometimes months. It's been a whole different dynamic and really fascinating, hasn't it, Patrick?
Yeah, there are interesting ripple effects, because as you say, sometimes publicists or whatever will be disappointed that there aren't, hundreds watching live. But, then you watch over the next couple of days and people find their way to them at their own pace, at their own time.
Yes.
And that has ripples, book sales all over the place, not just through us, of course.
No, it's really been a fascinating thing, and I'm glad that we've been able to spend as much time as we have doing this and meeting new authors new to us. Sorry, I didn't say that right. Authors new to us, Marcie, like you. So thank you for spending some time with us. I wanted to add a note. I saw that you accidentally wrote me a note just a little while ago about somebody who needed a copy of your book to be on stage with you. I'd be happy if you want to send me the address. I'll be happy to send my art because I don't need it now.
Okay.
I just got, I can even tell you, I just got an email from you about you were going to be on stage with somebody.
This weekend.
Right. Oh, was it that fast?
Let's see, the book comes out, the official release is tomorrow. And so I have readings and signings just sort of back to back.
I'm sure you do.
I think it's Saturday.
Well, I probably can't well, maybe I can. Where is this person?
Duluth.
Oh, that'd be hard.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be better, I think, if your publisher sends her an electronic copy. I thought if it was somebody local that, I'd be happy because we send advanced reading copies to authors all over the country.
She could drive over to your house, Marcie, and pick one up.
Well, she's like 2 hours away.
Right.
2.5 hours away. Yeah. So she's in Duluth, I'm down here. But yeah, I think she'll get a PDF copy.
Yeah, no, that would make much more sense. When I saw UNC, to me, that means the University of New Mexico. So it threw me for,
Oh, okay, yeah.
right. So I was thinking local, but clearly not. Anyway, thank you, Marcie, for your time. It was a fascinating conversation. And I want to thank everybody who's been watching it tonight. We do have autographed copies freshly signed by Marcie. So I urge you to grab one while you can, and we can't offer you autographed copies of the backlist, but seems to me that this is only book 3, that the smart reader would start with book 1, Murder on the Red River, and work your way towards this. So give it a thought.
You don't have to do that. You could read this one like you did, and without
Yeah.
looking at the other ones.
I know, but I'm trying to encourage all 3, but you're
Yes.
absolutely right. That it's a rule of mystery fiction that while the characters' lives continue, every book has to have a complete plot. And if it doesn't, it flunks. So we go there. Anyway, good night, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank
Good
you.
night, Marcie. Enjoy the rest